So we get asked all the time by clients about traumatic brain injuries in cases, what they are and how to prove them and how they interact with cases. And traumatic brain injuries are really complex as they on human beings, number one, obviously, but as they involve cases. The most complex ones are ones that are mild traumatic brain injuries. So that's what we should talk about, because the real serious, significant traumatic brain injuries where people have obvious injuries or surgeries or real permanent neurological problems after a traumatic brain injury, those are more obvious and therefore easier to evaluate as a lawyer and litigate. It's the mild traumatic brain injuries that are much more complex. And they're really more complex because they're complex on an individual. So it used to be that people would say, oh, you had a concussion. But now we know a lot more about brain injuries and that a concussion actually causes a mild traumatic brain injury. So you can have a mild traumatic brain injury that exists for a short period of time. You're dizzy, you're nauseous, maybe you even lose consciousness for a short period of time, but then everything dissipates after a while. You have headaches, but it all goes away. And so there's no permanency, and that's fine. And very likely that wouldn't be a case that we would prosecute if it was something that resolved. But it's the mild traumatic brain injuries that linger that are really insidious, and they're really difficult to prosecute as a lawyer, and they're even more difficult to live with as a person. Because you can have a mild traumatic brain injury that involves shearing of axonal nerves in your brain. So your brain is connected by, various nerve ending fibers. They come together like, almost like my hands are. And you can have shearing of them. So you can have very, very subtle injuries to your brain that have really major effect on you. The real problem with these mild traumatic brain injuries is they're hard for other people to see. So you may have a mild traumatic brain injury, but your boss, your spouse, your friends, your kids may not see it, and they may not know it and realize what you as a person are experiencing when you have this mild traumatic brain injury. And what you may experience when you have that is just small differences. You may have an alteration in your personality. You may get more irritable. You may have headaches. You may get fatigued. You may not even realize it's connected to this head hit that you took in a car accident or something else. So all of these things can happen in a mild traumatic brain injury and go unnoticed by other people. There's even a number of traumatic brain injuries that people suffer where even they themselves are sort of unaware of it. Like you're in your own head and you don't realize, why do I feel a little different? We heard a lot about that during the height of the pandemic with COVID, where people were having COVID fog. They just weren't feeling themselves in their own brain due to the virus and the virus having an effect on their neurological system. Well, that is exactly what can happen in a mild traumatic brain injury situation, where you have these just slight alterations in your ability to perform. Sometimes it's in your cognitive abilities, your higher level functioning. So doctors talk about executive functioning. So that's doing something like really complex that requires a number of steps. You can have a mild traumatic brain injury that doesn't affect you doing anything like getting up, going to work, making breakfast, your normal activities of daily living. But then it does affect you when you're trying to perform in a high level executive functioning aspect of your brain. So it goes all across the spectrum, these mild traumatic brain injuries. But one thing that's consistent about them is that people don't often see that on you. And you yourself may have trouble articulating what the difference is in you. So then when you take those kind of things and then try to apply it to a case and say, oh, I have somebody with a mild traumatic brain injury. How do you then prove that to a jury or a judge? Or most of the time we're looking at insurance carriers and defense lawyers. So oftentimes you'd want diagnostic tools to do that. But an MRI or a CAT scan many times is not going to show a very mild traumatic brain injury, right? So you don't have a broken skull. You don't have an obvious bruise on your head from the hit you took. You don't have an MRI or a CAT scan that shows a bleeding or something obvious. Yet you have an alteration in this person that's really significant, because having a personality alteration or headaches or inability to perform higher level functioning, these are horrible things for somebody to have if they're permanent. And how do you get that across to somebody? Well, there is some new technology now. They're called diffuse tensor imaging. They're a much more sophisticated type of diagnostic test that can look for this type of injury in your brain and can show it. That's a tool we use. We also use another tool called neuropsychological testing, So that's a really sophisticated tool that has to be administered by neuropsychologists who are trained to give you various tests. And the tests really can't be fooled. They're not like a math test, or a reading test or vocabulary. There are various puzzles and things that go all across the spectrum that have been designed to see if you have mild traumatic brain injuries. And they initially are designed to really discover Alzheimer's and, degenerative brain injuries, which also bear similarities. So imagine you're 25, but you have this mild traumatic brain injury. That is, in essence, the similar thing to your parents when they turn 75 or 80, and you start noticing as a child, boy, their behavior is a little different. They're more irritable. They're tired more frequently. They're not focused as much. They're having trouble pulling the right words out. So we see these things with people that age, but when you're the victim of a trauma and you have them, it's very much the same thing, except of course you're much younger. So these are really complex cases, and lawyers that handle these kind of cases need to really understand the medicine. They really need to understand the diagnostic tools that need to be employed, diffuse tensor imaging being one of them, neuropsychological testing being another one of them, and long-term documentation of these injuries, or asking the right questions of the clients to elicit the factual support that you actually have a mild traumatic brain injury that is hard for somebody else to see and even maybe doesn't appear on diagnostics. So it's a very complex issue of medicine, an equally complex issue in the medical legal world, and of course, a really horrible thing for somebody to experience through trauma. And so like I said, I think the best correlation I could think of to trying to explain this to somebody is it's very much like watching your parents as they age have differences in their personalities or their ability to do certain things, even subtle ones, and that's just coming from a normal degenerative brain aging process. But when you have that because of someone else's negligence, it's a far different story. Now somebody's saying, I don't believe it. Prove it to me. You better be ready to do that. Well, the number one thing you should do if you think you've sustained a traumatic brain injury is obviously get emergency medical care. All right. If you think you've sustained a traumatic brain injury, then that means you've had some kind of trauma to your head. And if that happens, the first thing that you want to rule out is a brain bleed, is an actual rupture of a vessel in your brain, because that in and of itself it could kill you if it's big enough, but B, it can cause enough of a pooling of the liquid blood in your brain to cause damage. So what happens when you have a brain bleed is the fluid, the blood leaks into your skull cavity, and the fluid is not compressible and your skull cavity is not expandable. So once enough blood pools in your brain, it starts pushing the only thing that it can, which is your brain tissue, which is soft. And if it pushes it enough, it can cause damage. And if it pushes it even more, it can cut off all neurological functioning, cause you permanent neurological damage or death. So if you think you've had any traumatic brain injury at all, even a subtle one, so a kid, collides with another kid on a soccer field and he's not quite all there, the first thing you're looking to do is rule out any kind of brain bleed, because that can really kill you or cause significant permanent damage. Once you've ruled that out and said, okay, well, thankfully I don't have that, but you think you may have a more subtle or mild traumatic brain injury, what you can do after that is somewhat limited. You want rest. You want to monitor your condition to see if it changes, if your symptoms change, if you're nauseous, you're dizzy, you're having trouble speaking. That could be indicative of the symptoms, the situation worsening. So you want to monitor that. You want to get into your primary care physician. You want to see a neurologist and have him do neurological testing on you. So neurological testing can be done in different ways. There's clinical and diagnostic. So the diagnostic is take an MRI, take a CT scan. That would show if there's a brain bleed or any damage. But the other diagnostic test, clinical testing that can be done by a neurologist are neurological tests. So trained neurologists are able to test you in certain ways to see how your brain is functioning. And there's a lot. Some of them are simple as touching your finger to your nose while you're standing. Almost like drunk driving tests that people are familiar with. Those are really actually complex neurological tests to test neurological functioning. So you want a competent neurologist to look at you, to examine you, to see if any of these signs and symptoms are there related to traumatic brain injury. And hopefully they're not. So if they're not, and then you're past all of that, but you still think something's wrong, something's off, you want to, again, document what's going on, but, to yourself if you can, like, oh, I'm forgetting my keys, or this is off, or I didn't know where I was for a second. Document that those things are happening. And if they persist or worsen, you got to go back to doctors to see what's going on. I think anybody that believes they've sustained a traumatic brain injury as a result of any kind of accident that anybody could be at fault at should immediately consult with a lawyer. First is obviously a medical professional. I mean, you got to go to the hospital and you got to get your doctors. That's always more important than any lawyer, by the way, in any injury case. The lawyer is secondary. The medical professionals are primary. So that's always the order of things in any injury case, and certainly in a traumatic brain injury case for sure. But absolutely, you should be contacting a lawyer thereafter. And you need to contact a lawyer that has experience handling traumatic brain injury cases because, like I said, unless they're, the most obvious one, you're in the hospital in a coma, okay, we know you have a traumatic brain injury. But it's the more mild ones that really require a lawyer that has the knowledge and the experience to know how to properly document that type of case for litigation purposes and how to get you to the right medical health professionals to not only document it, but also help diagnose what you have going on and help you get some improvement. Because there is some treatment for this. It's subtle, it's time consuming, it's neuropsychological treatment. Sometimes it's vocational treatment, or speech therapy treatment, memory treatment, and things like that help, and time. But lawyers that have experience with this know how to deal with it. And so they can help not only from a case standpoint, but also from a personal standpoint to getting you to the right people to document this and improve it, hopefully. How traumatic brain injuries affect people and their workplace is probably the first thing that happens. And secondarily is, what do you do with a case if that happens? Well, first, if you have a traumatic brain injury, it probably behooves you to, after you've documented it, to let your employer know that you have this situation so that you may get fatigued, that you may need breaks, that you may have certain difficulty, but that likely there's going to be some improvement. So I think good communication with your employer to document it is really, really important, as opposed to just failing at your job or, not performing up to your expectations or not showing up at your job at all and missing dates and things like that without explanation. That's going to lead to bigger problems at work. And it's also not going to help you if you have a case and you're saying, hey, I lost time from work or lost my job or my work was impacted on this. Well, the first thing a defendant's going to do is say, let's see your employment records. And if it doesn't reflect that, then you have a problem. So you want to be straightforward with your employer and document it with him or her and say, I had a car accident, I had a fall, I suffered a traumatic brain injury. I can be at work, but here's what my doctor's telling me. I may get fatigued. I may need to work shorter hours. I may at times, need to take breaks, things like that to accommodate me for this for some period of time. Being upfront with your employer is going to go a long way with your employer understanding if you're not performing up to his or her expectations. And it's also going to help you if you have a case in that it's documented at your workplace. So the Grieving Families Act is something that has been really, really in the news a lot lately for personal injury lawyers, but I'll bet most non-personal injury lawyers have no idea what it is. And if you're not following the news, it's a really, really significant, hopefully, change in the law in New York. New York is one of the few states in the country, incredibly, since obviously we're viewed as a very liberal, progressive type of state in our laws, but we have one of the most antiquated wrongful death laws in the country. And my partner Glenn and I did a whole webinar on wrongful death in New York. And actually it was a number of months ago. I thought by the time I was being asked this question that I'm asked today, that the Grieving Families Act will have changed wrongful death law in New York. Hasn't happened yet. So what the Grieving Families Act is it will allow families of people that were unfortunately killed as a result of someone's negligence to essentially sue for the value of that person's life and the value of the loss. So anytime we're talking to anybody and we say, oh my God, there has been a death, that to any person would say, well, that's the worst type of damage I could ever think of. And you'd be right. Except in New York State, when I get to a jury, I'm only allowed right now, as the way the law is, to sue for economic losses that person sustained or that person's pain and suffering, conscious pain and suffering. So think about that for a second. So let's take two different people. Let's take a widow and a Wall Street stock hedge fund broker. Let's imagine they're sharing a taxi cab together and they're struck by a tractor trailer with unlimited insurance policy. And both the widow and the hedge fund employee are killed in the accident. Both of them live for 60 seconds, obviously in excruciating pain and horrible, right? Both of them knew they might pass away, might die. So they have another category of damages I can present to a jury called fear of impending death. Trial lawyers like me, we had to create these categories because we weren't able to sue for the death per se. So let's get back to the widow and the hedge fund employee. Each of them comes to me. I'm bringing a lawsuit. So the widow, I sue for her conscious pain and suffering, 60 seconds. Whatever a jury can give on that. Some limitations on that by the courts. I get the same amount for the hedge fund guy, no problem. Then I sue for fear of impending death. I get the same amount for both of them. They both were going to die. It was a horrible thing. Jury awards money for that. Now I move forward. For the widow, I have no more claim. She's a widow and retired. I should have said that too. She's an elderly widow, retired, no children. That's the end of my claim. I have no economic claim for her. So there's nothing, let's say she has a distant relative too. That's the estate. Her estate, whomever that is, can't recover for her death because she wasn't earning any money and wasn't providing any guidance for anybody. She's an elderly widow, wasn't living with anybody, and wasn't going to provide an inheritance to anybody. She didn't have anything. So her claim ends right there. But the hedge fund guy, he's making, I don't know, $2 million a year. He has a pension, he has life insurance, he has all this kind of stuff, benefits and stuff for his family. His claim might be worth multi-millions. Think about that for a second. How biased is that? How wrong is that? Okay. And you could change the elderly widow and make her a student. You could make him or her just a single person without a spouse, without any children, with earning a small amount of money. And the equations would be the same. It's one of the most crazy, inequitable things I've ever seen in my life as a lawyer. And, I was brought up as a lawyer by my father, by my grandfather, to believe that the law makes sense. And so even if you don't know the law, normally when you figure it out, it makes sense. Well, this one doesn't. This wrongful death statute in New York does not make sense. It's unfair. It's just inequitable. And because of that, trial lawyers have fought really, really hard. And it always is the trial lawyers. It's people like me and the groups that we belong to that fight. And it's costly to do that, to try to get new laws passed. And we did. We've got a new law passed called the Grieving Families Act that would change this wrongful death law and make it equitable so that everybody's the same. And you can sue for that loss, the death, the loss of that person, whatever the value is to a jury or to the surviving family members. And it's not dependent on their earnings history and who they are, where they are in life, but just who they were as a person. So the Grieving Families Act changes that, covers that. And it was passed by both of the legislative branches in the New York State government, the Senate and the legislature. So it's really close to being a law, but it's sitting on our governor's desk, waiting for her to go like this. I don't know why. But in my experience as an attorney, the fact that it's been sitting on our desk for so long tells me somebody doesn't like it. And there's probably some pressure on the governor to not sign it. And the only place that pressure really could come from are the people that would be paying these damages, which are normally, almost always, 99% of the time, insurance companies or large corporations. So when somebody's killed by someone's negligence and someone like me gets involved, 99.9% of the time, we're really looking for insurance money, or if it's a deep-pocketed corporation that was responsible, that's who we're looking to hold responsible. So those are the people that stand to be hurt the most by the Grieving Families Act. And the people that stand to benefit the most from it is everybody in New York State that doesn't even realize this exists. So quite a remarkable situation we're in. And I guess if this episode gets out and you're watching it and this law hasn't become law yet, you should get on the phone or send an email. It actually does make a difference. I know people don't think it does, but it really, really does. Because right now this law is sitting on our governor's desk waiting for her signature. That's the last barrier. And then everybody's treated the same in that horrible, horrible situation that none of us want to be in. Right now, we're not being treated the same.